Hi everyone, this is Jikai Dehn of the Enmitsuji Tendai Temple, helping you to become the potent advocate of Dharma that the Buddha calls us to be. After our previous video, I received a number of messages asking how one might go about learning classical Chinese in order to read Buddhist texts. And so in this video, I intend to provide some instruction and advice on how this can be done. I must state at the outset that I am no master of this language by any means, and so if you find a better source of information on the topic, I advise you to defer to their expertise. In the meantime, however, I hope to provide a little bit of information that will get you on the right track and make you aware of the resources available to you. For simplicity's sake, I will be making a number of assumptions in this video, and so if any of these do not apply to you, don't be afraid to adapt my suggestions to your particular circumstances. In any case, the assumptions I'll be making are as follows. 1. You're a native speaker or fluent speaker of English. 2. Your primary goal in learning pre-modern Chinese is to read Buddhist texts specifically. 3. You don't necessarily possess experience with a modern Chinese language or a language which utilizes Chinese characters, such as Japanese. And finally, I will assume that you're self-studying and without a teacher. Along the way, I'll try to provide some tips on how one might go about learning a quote-unquote dead language, that is, a language which no one speaks anymore as their first language. And finally, as someone whose own learning of this particular language was conducted with both modern and traditional methods, I'll do my best to comment on the strengths of both approaches. So let's get into it. Before diving into the learning process itself, we would do well to clarify some terms. You'll often hear people refer to pre-modern Chinese as either classical Chinese or literary Chinese. Indeed, I'll probably use both of those terms interchangeably in this video. But it's wise to get a sense of what is technically speaking covered by these two respective terms. Strictly speaking, Classical Chinese refers to the language in which the early Chinese classics were written. Now, this was a period between approximately the 5th century BC and the end of the Han dynasty in 220 AD. Works in Classical Chinese then would include things like the Book of Odes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, to name a few. And so Classical Chinese is so called because it is the language of the classics. However, by the 3rd century AD, vernacular or spoken Chinese had developed far beyond the language of the classics, and so it is from this time onwards that the formal written Chinese would in a certain sense attempt to mimic the language of the earlier classics, but naturally began to shift somewhat as it encompassed changes in the vernacular languages. This attempt at mimicry was now not the way the Chinese spoke, but a more formal written style, and so it is to this specifically that we refer when we say literary Chinese. So literary Chinese, therefore, is the written language in China from the 3rd century AD until the end of the Republican period in 1949 AD rather. Needless to say, literary Chinese underwent numerous changes across the vast expanse of time and was impacted by different regions, local vernacular, and varieties and variations that come from different places and different ethnic groups. What's more, when one reads different types of texts written in literary Chinese, say for example you read a medicinal text and a Buddhist text, i.e. two very different genres, you'll find that much of the vocabulary and even some of the grammar patterns and syntax are distinctive in each. You might get very good at reading poetry then, but be unable to understand Buddhist texts. It is for this reason that I sometimes refer to literary Chinese as a quote-unquote guild language. What I mean by this is that unless you're already part of the club, as it were, and familiar with that certain genre's way of communicating, it's very likely that you'll struggle to comprehend the literature of that particular field. The form of literary Chinese used in Buddhist texts, then, is one such guild, and it can use slightly different terms and structures depending on the period or region in which the work in question was written or translated. Now, one feature which is very common in Buddhist literary Chinese, for example, is that it includes a great many disyllabic or polysyllabic words. Now, these are either transliterations of Sanskrit words, which use multiple Chinese characters to represent the sound but not the meaning of an Indic term, or alternatively, they're compound words, wherein multiple characters are placed together to represent a single Buddhist concept. Now, an example of the former would be the word Puti Sadwa, which is an attempt to sound out the Sanskrit word bodhisattva. This is often shortened, for example, to Pusa, by taking the first and the third characters of that word. An example of the latter, that is those compound words, would be something like 众生, which is used to mean sentient beings, but literally means multitude of lives or multitude of births, if we take the characters separately. All of this to say that learning to read Chinese Buddhist texts in literary Chinese presents its own challenges, and if your primary aim is indeed to read these Buddhist texts, then your approach to studying the language should be tailored to this goal. This is not to say that you can't go on to read Confucian and Taoist texts later either, and by doing so expand the genres in which you feel comfortable, but you'll have a much better chance of staying the course through the thousands of hours required to get comfortable with the language if you build your fundamentals within the type of texts that interest you most. Literary Chinese is indisputably the lingua franca of East Asia. Much like Latin in Europe, literary Chinese as a written medium was the mode of communication for most educated men and women in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Constructed as it is out of characters rather than a syllabary, it was flexible enough that it could be read in various different ways in different countries. And yet, it could be used in the written form to communicate between parties with mutually unintelligible spoken languages. If you have any interest, then, in the history and culture of these places, literary Chinese will open doors to otherwise closed worlds. For our purposes specifically, by learning literary Chinese, one also gains access to the largest Buddhist canon available by a very great margin. Many important Buddhist texts are preserved only in the Chinese, and there is something magical about being able to read texts like the technical Mahavibhasha or being able to read the travelogues of monks who travelled from China to India in the originals. The sheer volume of the Chinese Buddhist canon must rank as the greatest transmission of knowledge from one civilization to another ever undertaken. Though some texts have been lost to time, and there are many not included in the formal canons, the present Taisho edition of the Tripitaka alone is 100 volumes in length and contains some 5,320 individual works. If you have any interest in cross-cultural communication, or you hope to adapt Buddha Dharma to your own cultural sphere and language, I can imagine no better teacher than the Chinese Buddhist canon. Furthermore, if you belong to an East Asian Buddhist tradition, it's certain that some, if not all, of your texts will have been preserved in this form of Chinese, and so learning even a modicum of the language will allow you at the very least to pass materials with the help of a translation. At a certain point in your Buddhist journey, it's invaluable to be able to check the text for yourself and not rely solely on the translations of others. A translation, after all, is an interpretation, especially with a language as concise as literary Chinese. And any time you read a translation then, you must hope that the translator in question has judged appropriately in his or her interpretation. And finally, we should take a brief moment to consider the absurdity of the Western Buddhists' present predicament. Although for most of Buddhist history, Buddhist texts were translated by fellow Buddhists who were not only familiar with these works, but also the living tradition, for most Western Buddhists, on the other hand, we must rely on translations initiated in large part by non-Buddhists. Those non-Buddhists are perhaps looking for different things in our texts than we are. Could there be anything more dangerous then than a religious community relying on those outside of it to teach and transmit its most precious of possessions? Now, this is something like the situation faced by Western Buddhists today, as a good portion of our resources are the products of non-Buddhists. That we should praise these scholars for their untiring assistance in this endeavour is without doubt. But we should do so with a certain degree of shame and embarrassment, and ask why we as Buddhists haven't taken more of this responsibility upon our own shoulders. Now, it's of course obvious that a scholar and being a Buddhist are not mutually exclusive labels. But if we recognize this, then we can surely recognize that we as Buddhists can do more. We do not have the funding to set in motion great translation bureaus like occurred in Imperial China. But we can develop our own skills in things like literary Chinese, and perhaps one day be in a position to have our offerings included among the rest. For this purpose, literary Chinese is the helping hand that will get us there, and so anyone willing to learn it should be encouraged to do so. Now, my encouragement of those wanting to learn the language should not be understood in any way to be the suggestion that Buddhists cannot attain awakening without learning a primary language or anything silly like that. But if we raise up those amongst our ranks who are keen to learn the language, it cannot but elevate our collective efforts. Now, if you intend to jump straight into Buddhist materials from the get-go, then the best beginner textbook material has to be Dr. John Kieschnick's Primers in Chinese Buddhist Writings. Graciously, these are all available online as free PDFs, and I'll leave a link in the description to the portal from which you can download them. The first 3 volumes of his primers are called introductory texts, and they'll have you reading real Buddhist texts from the very beginning. Volume 1, called Foundations, begins with 10 lessons introducing the basic grammatical conventions of literary Chinese. I say grammatical conventions here rather than rules because, as Kieschnick makes clear in the very first lesson, literary Chinese grammar rules are more like guidelines, with many an exception to be found. This is because, unlike in English, Chinese words are not restricted to specific word classes. In English, for example, certain words are always verbs or doing words, and others are always nouns or persons, places and things. These are their word classes necessarily. In Chinese, however, the same character can function as a noun and a verb, and so words are therefore far more flexible than we're used to. Indeed, given the incredible difficulty of learning copious numbers of characters, Chinese developed a less stringent fixing of their grammar. Unlike Latin, for example, where one has such things as cases and declensions that guide one's reading every step of the way, Chinese characters cannot be declined or conjugated. And so learning the fundamental grammatical conventions of literary Chinese is not particularly difficult. And Dr. Kieschnick's first volume does a fairly good job of introducing these foundations in those first 10 lessons. So given the simplicity of the grammar, the far more taxing component of learning to read pre-modern Chinese is developing a copia verborum, or a rich vocabulary amidst the thousands of characters. In order to achieve this, the second and greater part of Kieschnick's first volume takes you through 65 individual portions of a scripture from the Dirghagama, called the Mahavadana Sutra. Vocabulary lists are provided for each of these chunks, and once you've completed this section of the primer, you'll have effectively gone through the entire sutra minus the verses. The third and final portion of this Foundations volume has you reread through the scripture without any vocabulary or aids, as a form of review. For those who've never studied Chinese before, Dr. Kieschnick has graciously provided audio recordings for the entire volume. Once again, I'll leave a link in the description. These recordings will ensure that you learn how to read pinyin, for example, or the primary romanization method for characters in mainland China. He also provides translations for all of the materials used, which as a self-learner will give you the capacity to correct and improve your own work and check your answers. Volume 2 of his introductory primers is called the Indian Tradition and is structured in the same way as Part 2 and Part 3 of Volume 1. This format will continue for the rest of his primers. Now this second volume, as the name might suggest, takes you through 3 specifically Indian texts. The first is a section from the account of the World Sutra, which survives only in this Chinese translation. The second consists of segments of the Abhidharmakosha and the Mahavibhasha. And the final section is a portion of the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, detailing the origin of the Bhikshuni or female order of monastics. In short, what's great about this volume is at this point you'll have already encountered texts from each of the Pitakas of the canon, or the Tripitaka. Once again, having gone through each of these texts with the aid of vocabulary lists, you then reread the texts without aids as a form of review. We now come to the third and final introductory primer provided by Dr. Kieschnick. This volume is called Buddhist Texts Composed in China and does much the same thing as the former volume, with the exception that herein you have 8 primary Chinese works instead of Indian ones. There's also 3 additional texts in a section at the back called Further Reading. In summary, if you make it through these 3 introductory primers, you should have not only established a firm foundation in the grammar, but be well on your way to developing that copia verborum that is crucial for your long-term success in literary Chinese. Now, some may be wondering at this point if it's really useful to complete 3 beginner textbooks like this before moving into those texts that we would call intermediate materials. You might be looking at this description and thinking that this looks a bit like overkill. But I would advise you unreservedly that yes, it is incredibly useful to complete all 3 of these introductory primers provided by Dr. Kieschnick. This is because, given the vast number of characters and words with which you'll be confronted when you explore Buddhist texts on your own, the quantity and volume of your reading is far more important than the quality of your reading in literary Chinese. I'm going to say that one more time. The quantity and volume of your reading in literary Chinese is far more important than the quality of your reading. In other words, it's far better for you to read 300 pages of simple but engaging Buddhist texts than 100 pages of more complex works by someone like Jikai or Saichou. This is because, as we've mentioned multiple times so far, literary Chinese has very little of the grammar that we're used to seeing. And so the traditional way of learning those grammatical patterns and syntax was by reading extensively and absorbing the patterns and precedents of previous writers. In fact, due to the flexibility of Chinese words, the only proper semantic distinction that was made traditionally in the way that we are familiar with, say, in word classes, is the division of Chinese characters and words into 2 groups. One of these groups is called genuine words, or perhaps content words. Now, these account for nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. The second category of words traditionally separated from these content words are what are called empty words. That means that they're function words or particles, and they perform the majority of grammatical functions. They're referred to as empty because their meaning is usually determined by the surrounding context, and so it is, to a certain extent, supplied from outside. In short, you have a much better chance of staying afloat when you venture into texts on your own if you have had as much exposure to various texts and different kinds of texts as possible before doing so. I would therefore urge that you don't skip any of these 3 introductory primers. If you wish to become a lifelong reader of Chinese Buddhist texts, the one piece of advice I can provide you is read, read, and read some more. Don't rush into reading difficult texts or authors. It's better to get to them past your time than before you're ready. An alternative path might be to attempt to study literary Chinese more broadly from the beginning. Rather than jumping into literature that is specifically Buddhist then, this would entail beginning with a textbook that provides a vast range of material but naturally also still covers Buddhist writings. If you choose to begin with this approach, the only resource which still includes Buddhist texts within its scope would be the new 2nd edition of Dr. Michael A. Fuller's An Introduction to Literary Chinese. Before going any further, I must stress that you want to purchase the new 2nd edition and not the first. Both have different covers, so it should be fairly easy to distinguish between the two. The reason you want the 2nd edition specifically is because the major reason for producing this new edition was precisely to include a chapter on Buddhist texts. And so the 1st edition, while still one of the best textbooks available on literary Chinese, does not cover Buddhist writings. Dr. Fuller's textbook is rigorous, not only in its scope, but also in its insistence that you learn from the very beginning how to utilize resources such as dictionaries, as well as get into the habit of conferring with commentary material from the get-go. These are absolutely essential skills which you have to pick up at some point on your journey. So it might as well be introduced and exposed to you as early as is practicable. The textbook itself is divided into 4 parts. The first presents 8 lessons on the basic syntactic components and grammar of the language. Part 2 is made up of 16 lessons which increase in length and complexity in order to solidify your grasp of the basics, while simultaneously exposing you to new types of texts. Part 3 introduces students to key authors and philosophical traditions in pre-modern China, which are designed to highlight the elements of cultural, philosophical, and historical knowledge that are required when making sense of a text. You'll remember once again that given the grammatical flexibility and the vast expanse of time during which literary Chinese was used, one must make a conscious effort to familiarize themselves with the content matter at hand in order to learn the guild language. Finally, Part 4 has 6 lessons consisting of important Tang and Song dynasty prose and poetry. All in all, there are 36 lessons, with lesson 30 constituting the chapter on Buddhist texts specifically. Now, this chapter on Buddhist texts provides a good spread of 3 texts from different genres. Namely, it provides a Jataka tale or story of a former life of the Buddha. It also provides the monastic biography of the monk Jivaka, and it finishes with the famous Heart Sutra. Now, each lesson within Fuller's textbook begins with an overview of its topic, then it introduces example texts, and finally it provides a glossary, notes, and practice exercises. The activities in particular would prove useful to anyone coming out of Dr. Kieschnick's introductory primers, so you may choose to add this textbook to the former plan rather than use it on its own. Luckily for us, Dr. Kieschnick has gone to the trouble of providing 3 more primers, which he labels as supplements on the portal. And the first 2 of these supplements work very well as intermediate guided readers. The first supplementary primer is specifically dedicated to Mahayana texts. Following the same format as previous volumes, you'll read through sections of the following: the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Ashta Sahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra, and the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha. The second supplementary primer is dedicated to esoteric texts, and so you'll read through pieces of the following: the miscellaneous collection of Dharanis, the Mahavaipulya Dharani Sutra, the Abhisheka Sutra, the Mantra of Hariti Sutra, the Buddha expounds the Dharani to save the burning mouth Preta Sutra, the Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani Sutra, the biography of Vajra Bodhi from the Song Gao Seng Zhuan, the Vajra Shakara Sutra, and the Havajra Tantra. Now, the third volume of Kieschnick's supplementary primers is very useful as well, but it focuses on epigraphy and inscriptions, and so whether or not you choose to complete that particular supplementary primer might depend somewhat on the kind of materials you hope to read. Outside of these wonderful primers, there is also the Locke and Linebarger textbook called Chinese Buddhist Texts, an Introductory Reader. Locke and Linebarger's textbook can be purchased at the link included in the description, and it jumps straight into primary texts as well. Divided into 12 units, each containing 3 extracts of primary material, one makes their way through both Chinese and Indian Buddhist works. These are namely the Heart Sutra, selections from the Agamas, the Diamond Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Discourse on the 10 Wholesome Ways of Action Sutra, the biography of Kumara Jiva, the essential methods for the practice of Shamatha and Vipassana seated meditation by Jikai, also known as the Xiaozhiguan, or Lesser Calming and Contemplation, the Platform Sutra, Yongjia's Song of Enlightenment, the Blue Cliff Record, Liao Fan's 4 Lessons, and Zhu Gui's commentary on the Heart Sutra. You may have noticed that the latter half of this book definitely skews towards a Chan Zen focus, but it's still quite neat that one starts with the Heart Sutra and ends with a commentary on it. After all, getting used to consulting and navigating commentarial material is often absolutely crucial, especially for the more difficult philosophical works. Now, the first 5 units of this textbook include pinyin as well as literal word-by-word English glosses for all extracts. These can be useful for those who are trying to memorize or recite the texts as part of their Buddhist practice. Otherwise, each unit contains the following: the extracts themselves, the vocabulary lists, and then a notes section highlighting any important grammatical features or thematic information. There was a website as well for this textbook, which included a forum and audio recordings, but as of making this video, it appears not to be fully functioning. I will include the link to this platform in the description below, however, in the hopes that this is just a temporary issue rather than a permanent one. Locke and Linebarger do assume that you have approximately a year of modern Chinese under your belt first, but this is primarily because they hope that you've had some experience with basic Chinese characters. This may therefore be used instead of the Kieschnick primers for those who are what we would call false beginners in Chinese, or as a follow-on once the primers have been completed. And this is why I mention it here as an intermediate resource, even though it is called an introductory reader. The method of instruction differs from that of Dr. Kieschnick's primers, and so this textbook is also a great counterbalance which is worth investing in after you've done the primers. Now that you're well and truly on your way to developing your reading abilities in literary Chinese, you'll need to be aware of useful reference material. No doubt, you'll be venturing into text on your own at this point, at least tentatively, and so it's wise to touch on dictionaries and grammars, which just may save you a headache or two. I'm not aware of any grammars which deal specifically with Buddhist materials, but there are a number of English language grammars of classical and literary Chinese which can come in handy. The first is the Old Faithful of Edwin G. Pulleyblank's Outline of Classical Chinese Grammar. This is perhaps the most comprehensive treatment of the grammar in English, and it's therefore essential for long-term study. But it can be a little bit difficult to approach in the early stages, especially if you've not previously studied a classical language like Latin or Greek. A more approachable work for beginners is probably Archie Du's Handbook of Classical Chinese Grammar. Du here is rather confusingly not a person's name, but an unusual and unaccountable way of abbreviating Durham University without capitalizing the U. In any case, this work is far more user-friendly than Pulleyblank and will offer you guidance in most of the major grammatical constructions and particles or empty words, here referred to as function words. The latter section of this grammar contains a number of stories which function essentially as a reader with heavy grammatical notation. Another rather useful feature of this book is that while it does treat the grammar in a modern and rigorous fashion, it also gets the reader to think in traditional terms. That is, between these genuine words which have intrinsic content and the empty words or function words which require context. In my opinion, this more traditional approach is in many ways better suited to the study of pre-modern Chinese than attempting to apply things like word classes to a language that doesn't really fit into those neat boxes. And it's with the traditional methods in mind that I recommend the last two grammars. First is a dictionary of high-frequency function words in literary Chinese by Mea Tan. This work focuses exclusively on 80 of these empty words or function words, and the example passages for each all come with English translations, so it can therefore theoretically be used as a reader as well. The final work I'd like to mention is J.J. Brandt's old Wenli Particles, or Shi Zi Zhinan. Now this is a particularly old book, the first edition of which appeared in 1929, but various reprints can be found online from time to time. I suspect that the age of this work will be questioned by some viewers, and it's certainly true that we have come a long way in our understanding of classical Chinese since the 1920s. Nevertheless, this is to my mind the most comprehensive treatment of classical Chinese particles or empty words to date. It contains 194 of them and is divided in 27 categories for ease of recollection. There may be newer works on this subject out there somewhere, but I've yet to find one this extensive. I'd love to be proven wrong on this front, so please let me know in the comments if I've missed one. Don't get me wrong, this book is definitely not perfect. It can be tricky to find sometimes, though there are many reprints from Taiwan, like this one from the 1970s. Its other major drawback is that due to its age, it uses Wade-Giles romanization for Chinese words rather than the now more common pinyin. Nevertheless, if you intend to read Buddhist texts extensively in English, it's a good idea to learn Wade-Giles as well at some point, because the number of books still in use which make use of it is by no means insignificant. So this may be a benefit rather than a hindrance in the long run. And finally, despite all of its age and shortcomings, at 172 pages, it's very small and compact, and it can be easily carried about when traveling for study. Due to the sheer number of Chinese characters and the relative flexibility with which they can be used, it's absolutely impossible to read extensively without access to good dictionaries. For Buddhist texts, the best English language dictionary available is without doubt Dr. Charles Muller's DDB, or Digital Dictionary of Buddhism. Now this comes as well with the companion CJKVE dictionary. This DDB, or Digital Dictionary of Buddhism, is a compilation of Buddhist terms from Buddhist canonical sources which have been contributed by scholars within the field. It can be used via the website in the description or via the DDB Access app on both one's computer or smartphone. Now there are a number of ways to gain access to this resource depending on your circumstances. For example, you can get limited use of the dictionary by simply typing guest as the username and leaving the password blank. This will allow you a total of 20 searches in each of the DDB and the CJKVE dictionaries in a 24-hour period. Now, if you require unlimited use of the DDB, there are three primary options. The first is by making contributions to the dictionary itself. So the larger purpose of the DDB is to bring about a collaborative effort that will lead to the eventual development of a comprehensive body of data within the field. In order to accomplish this, the DDB needs contributions towards content development from its users. So if you hold a minimum of a master's degree in a related field at a fully accredited institution, you can obtain unlimited usage by becoming a contributor to the DDB. Specifically, you can secure 2 years of unlimited access by contributing entry materials the equivalent of 1 A4 or letter size page, so approximately 350 words. The second option by which you can obtain unlimited access is through an institution's paid subscription. So for example, if you're a student or lecturer at an academic institution, said institution may have or be able to pay for a subscription on your behalf. And the final option for unlimited use is individual paid subscriptions. In other words, individual users who are unable to make a content contribution can still get unlimited access by contacting the dictionary and paying a small fee for an individual subscription. Now, this is a fantastic resource with contributions from many of the leading scholars within the field. So where possible, I encourage you to support this project, either personally or via your institutions. If you download the app itself, which I believe was developed in conjunction with Smart Hansa, you'll have access to not only the dictionaries themselves, but also a feature called the text parsing feature. So this is a feature wherein you can copy paste a chunk of text and it will give you definitions for all the terms that it finds within. Another incredible and extremely useful dictionary, which I would recommend if you're reading Buddhist texts to use, is Pleco, sometimes referred to as Pleco. So this is an application that's available on your smartphone, and it's currently the #1 Chinese dictionary software in the English-speaking world. Now, the basic version of the app is free from the App Store. And when you download it as the free basic version, you can also freely download William Soothill's A Dictionary of Chinese Buddhist Terms, which contains 16,000 Buddhist-specific entries. And you can also get, I believe, Wiseman's Dictionary of Chinese Medical Terms, which again does pop up from time to time in pre-modern Chinese texts. There are as well a number of purchasable dictionaries, which are very, very useful for you. The best perhaps would be Paul Kroll's A Student's Dictionary of Classical and Medieval Chinese, which is the best English language dictionary of classical Chinese to date. If you become comfortable with reading modern Chinese along your journey of learning classical Chinese, you can also purchase the Gu Hanyu Da Zidian, the Hanyu Da Zidian, and the Guoyu Zidian. All of these are extensive dictionaries that include a copious number of pre-modern example passages for each definition. Now, having access to such extensive dictionaries means that you'll almost always be able to work through the issues that you come across in the Buddhist texts that you're reading. But there are also other features to the Pleco app, paid features, which might be useful to you as readers of Buddhist texts. The first is what's called the optical character recognizer. So this will allow you to use the camera on your smartphone to look up unknown characters. The second feature which might be useful to you is the flashcard feature. Now this, of course, as the name might suggest, allows you to make personal decks of terms that you come across regularly. I might point out as well that there is a flashcard deck for the first 3 introductory volumes of Dr. Kieschnick's introductory primers. And of course, to use that, you would need the flashcard feature. Another great feature which can be purchased for a small fee from the Plico app is the document reader. And this works in much the same way as the DDB Access app's text parsing feature. So in other words, with the document reader, you can open texts within the Plico app and it will allow you to look up the words simply by clicking on them. But there's a second feature which takes this function to the next level and is incredibly useful for you if you're reading Buddhist texts. If you purchase the Chung text-to-speech feature, then any document which you open within the Plico document reader can be read aloud by an AI voice as you read. Now, this is invaluable when it comes to classical Chinese because as a so-called dead language, it doesn't have native speakers with whom you can speak and get listening practice. You can use features like this, however, to engage those auditory elements of language learning. So if you don't purchase this feature specifically and rely on the free base version of Plico, you'll still be able to have words searched and read aloud individually. You just won't be able to have the full text read in a continuous fashion. Even if you intend only to use the free version of Plico, I would still highly recommend that you make use of this application. If you'd prefer not to use digital applications like the DDB or Digital Dictionary of Buddhism or the Plico app on your smartphone, you can still, of course, use paper dictionaries. The first option in this regard would be to get a hard copy of one of those dictionaries that I mentioned with the Plico app. That is Paul Kroll's A Student's Dictionary of Classical and Medieval Chinese. The second hard copy dictionary that you can source is William Soothill's A Dictionary of Chinese Buddhist Terms. Now, Soothill's dictionary is very old and so it's now in the public domain. So you can find PDF versions of this as well as various reprints online. As you make your way through the infamous intermediate plateau, you're most likely going to be reading texts on your own and exploring whichever type of text interests you most. Now, although some university departments are not particularly fond of them, I recommend it's at this stage that you make use of bilingual readers. So bilingual texts can either be facing page bilingual texts, so that means you've got English on one page and then the Chinese original on the facing page, or they can separate the two versions. So in other words, you can have the English translation in the front of the book and then perhaps the Chinese original in the back of the book. Needless to say, initially you'll find the facing page versions of bilingual texts most useful for your reading practice. When you start out, it's easiest to use punctuated text first and then move to unpunctuated texts. So traditionally texts either have no punctuation at all or they merely have full stops to guide your reading. And so modern editions of Buddhist texts often add punctuation to make them easier to read and parse. In your earlier stages, this punctuation can be incredibly useful, but as you may have guessed, punctuation is in part an interpretation of the text, just like a translation. So it's a good idea at some point to eventually get used to reading text without punctuation and even punctuating text yourself as a form of practice. So a good example of a facing page bilingual text that has added punctuation would be something like the Fo Guangshan's editions of the Great Perfection of Wisdom treatise or the Dajrudulan. Now this is a work in progress, but in theory you'll eventually have 100 fascicles of text which you can use for reading practice. I think at the moment they have about 25 fascicles available for purchase. An example, on the other hand, of a facing page bilingual text that does not have punctuation added to the Chinese would be any of Bhikshu Dharmamitra's translations with his Kalavinka press. Now, Bhikshu Dharmamitra is a very skilled translator, so even though the Chinese does not include punctuation, you can always use the facing page English as a guide when lost. The other added bonus to Bhikshu Dharmamitra's versions is that he usually doesn't just include the Chinese original in traditional characters, but he also includes the Chinese original in simplified, which, if you have a past with modern Chinese in mainland China, might be of use to you as well. Coming in contact with unpunctuated texts in this context, that is, in the context of works like the Kalavinka press books, is perhaps the best way to make the transition from punctuated texts to unpunctuated texts. Good examples of bilingual texts which are not facing page texts, in other words, where you have the English translation in the front and then perhaps the Chinese in the back, would be things like the BTTS or Buddhist Text Translation Society's editions of the Lotus Sutra and their edition of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. If anyone, incidentally, from the BTTS happens to watch this video, if you ever decide to publish an edition of the Lotus Sutra with the opening and closing sutras, so that is the infinite meaning sutra at the beginning and the contemplation of Samantabhadra Sutra in the back, if you ever include a bilingual version with all three sutras, that would be a perfect publication. In any case, by separating the Chinese and English like this, you can utilize the Chinese in these editions as reading practice without relying too heavily on the crutch of the English translations included. But you still, of course, have the English translation close at hand for reference and review. I'll put links to all of these works in the description. As you make the shift into advanced territory and seeking texts out independently on your own all of the time, you'll naturally gravitate to certain parts of the canon. But in any case, you'll have enough knowledge and know-how to dip your toes as you like, at least in a casual fashion. And this is a great feeling. At this point, you'll feel much more comfortable reading, and reading some more. But one small piece of advice I would offer when you get to this stage is that on top of reading as you will, from time to time, pick a text and dive deep. In other words, keep studying as well as reading. It's easy at this stage to feel like the study part has finished and now the reading part takes over. Now, while that's certainly true in some sense, keep studying nonetheless. If you prefer physical copies of texts for this kind of deep dive study, a great option is to contact the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation. Now, this is a Taiwanese organization that prints Chinese Buddhist texts using donations. And so when they're able or have the texts available, they're very happy to send out copies to you if you make contact via their website. I'll put it in the description. If you're happy using digital texts, then of course you can explore the Chinese Tripitaka online. There are a couple of places to do this, but the most user-friendly place is probably the CBeta Online Reader website, again in the description. From the CBeta Online Reader website, you can access the majority of the canon, and for most texts, you're able to turn on or off punctuation. You can also download these texts from that website as PDFs and carry them with you on your smartphone or PC. And if you've downloaded Plico and purchased the document reader function, you can use such PDFs in the app and receive immediate definitions of all of the selected words and perhaps have the text brought to life with the Chang text-to-speech feature. If you haven't purchased the text-to-speech feature, don't forget that for most of the popular texts, like things like the Lotus Sutra, you can often find recitations and readings of these in the classical Chinese on places and platforms like YouTube. So it's always a good idea to do a quick Google or YouTube search. I'll leave an example of these kinds of recitations in the description. Connected to this CBeta online reader is what's called the CBeta Research Platform. Now this provides extra features, so things like search and comparison functions, and there is the Durdle parallel text editing platform, and that's essentially where scholars can add translations and work on them in real time. Now, I've made a very short video on the research platform in the past, so I'll leave the link to that video in the description in case you're interested in investigating that platform further. Another alternative to things like the document reader function in Plico or the parsing function in the DDB Access app is a website called the NTI Reader, which is run by Guangshan, I believe. Now, their database is much smaller, but the texts that they do have in their database provide definitions for each of the characters in the texts. And so even if you don't have access to the Plico versions of things, a great deal can still be done free of charge. When it comes to reviewing or practicing what you're learning, I'm afraid that the methods that I'm going to suggest here are the old-fashioned and traditional ones. There may be more cutting-edge strategies out there, so please discard this part of the video if you know better. But I can only speak to the methods I've utilized and perhaps suggest those methods which have been valued within the Buddhist tradition across time. So a quick warning here, there won't be anything too surprising. So when it comes to learning characters, the traditional method is to write characters and whole sentences out over and over again. This is best done with sheets of what are called genko yoshi in Japanese, and these can be printed from PDFs available online, or you can purchase sheets from online retailers like Amazon. So this very simple method will make writing and reading characters second nature in time. It will also help you to develop the balance and consistency in the size and shape of the characters that you're writing, because they're confined, of course, in these small boxes. But this rather mundane activity of copying out sentences can be part of your devotional Buddhist practice as well. If you're copying out Buddhist texts, this is a devotional exercise. You may be honing your capacity to write and remember Chinese characters, but you're also copying out words of the Dharma. This may not feel like the most glamorous of activities on the one hand, but when you reframe even this as part of your Dharma activity, then it becomes much more than mere copying. And what's more, it will be something that you're thankful for as part of your practice as well. You couldn't ask for a better way to study a language. What could be tedious drudgery is transformed into the work of bodhisattvas if you're intelligent about how you study the Buddhist texts in the canonical languages. So building on from this copying of the Buddhist texts, you can and should engage in reciting the texts out loud. Practically, you'll naturally increase your comfort in reading and pronunciation in this way, but you'll also begin to absorb the grammar and syntax and common expressions of the types of texts that you enjoy reading. So we mentioned that this is in fact the traditional way that students learn the grammatical constructions. And in this, therefore, you connect yourself with thousands and millions of devotees across time with whom you now share this practice of reading and reciting the texts. Once again, integrate your study of the canonical languages into your Dharma practice. You are not merely reciting in order to learn the grammar and, let's say, pronunciation. You're also absorbing the Dharma and sharing it with others as you read it over and over again. These texts that you recite out loud can also be the very same texts that you hear or listen to on platforms like YouTube as well. So, in other words, you can take these words, you can use the listening practice as a dual practice with your recitation practice and take them wherever you go. Indeed, this may be directly integrated into the text that you recite on a daily basis as part of your practice. If you have a daily gongyo practice, for example, in the Japanese traditions, integrate the recitation of a particular Chinese text into your daily practice. If you're able to unify your language study on the one hand with your Buddhist practice on the other, you'll find that you have a far greater staying power in the long run and the ability to maintain your language study in times of motivational lethargy, which of course we all experience at some point. In short then, don't restrict your study of the language to merely those moments when you're face-to-face with language textbooks. Another way of expanding your study of classical Chinese beyond those moments when you're face-to-face with language textbooks is to study the Dharma in English as well. I've said that pre-modern Chinese is something like a guild language, which in practical terms means that you'll have a far greater ability to navigate Chinese Buddhist texts if you have a degree of knowledge concerning the Buddhist ideas, scriptures, and arguments contained in them. Therefore, your very study of the Buddha Dharma more broadly, your reading of the Buddhist scriptures and treatises and Buddhist ideas in English all become part of your study of literary Chinese in an indirect way. It develops your ability to notice patterns and themes in the texts even before you come face to face with them. And so once again, my advice is read, read, and read some more, this time in English. We are now finally coming to the end of our ramble through my thoughts on learning pre-modern Chinese in order to read Buddhist texts. And so I'd like to summarize our trek by closing with some truisms as well as some encouragement should you take up this task. First, learning literary Chinese is not easy. On the FSI or Foreign Service Institute's scale for determining language difficulty for English speakers, modern Chinese is said to require approximately 88 weeks of intensive classes, or between 2,200 and 4,000 hours of active learning in order to develop fluency. That means if you spent an hour to an hour and a half a day, this would be between 4 and 8 years worth of your time. We must of course add to this estimation the fact that pre-modern Chinese is a so-called dead language, which makes active learning a little more difficult. Even those with experience learning classical languages like Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit will find pre-modern Chinese an entirely different beast, because it lacks the precision of the moods, tenses, genders, conjugations, declensions, and so forth possessed by these other ancient languages. All of this to say that it is not an easy undertaking, to say nothing of doing it alone without a teacher. Anyone who tells you otherwise is respectfully lying or trying to sell you something. But even doing a small portion of this study will put you streets ahead in your ability to understand Buddhist ideas. What's more, when all of this is thought of as part of your Buddhist cultivation, could you really give yourself any greater gift than between 2,000 and 4,000 hours of Buddhist practice and study? If you're someone who would otherwise spend a substantial portion of their life reading Buddhist materials and texts in English anyway, would you really be sacrificing anything at all if this reading was instead developed gradually in one of the original canonical languages? It may be hard, but most things in life which are valuable are hard. And you can learn how to read these materials just as many have done before you and as many will do after you, provided a few basic things. First, that you have sincere motivation to read the words of the Buddha as your base. On that motivation, you have a good plan for moving forward in the language. And finally, that you have a few good resources to draw upon. Your goal may be as large as reading as yet untranslated texts, or perhaps translating them yourself for others. Or perhaps it's a little smaller and you have a sincere desire to limit yourself to reading a particular sutra. Take the Lotus Sutra, for example. And you want to read that single text in the same words as the great masters of the past. Or it may even be as little and simple as wishing to learn important terminology and building the know-how to work with sticky passages that you find in translations when you want to cross-check them. In any case, you're limited only by your goal, your devotion, your practice, and the mental maturity to take mistakes in your stride. If you genuinely believe that you have the potential for the infinity that is Buddhahood within you, then believing that you could learn to read literary Chinese is but a speck of dust in comparison. This doesn't at all mean that you must learn this language in order to understand Buddha Dharma, nor that you require this training to attain awakening. But in no way does me admitting that diminish the beauty and importance of doing so if you're at all able to. And for those purposes, I hope that some of the information in this video helps you find your way. I myself am merely a student of this very difficult and beautiful language, and this ability to remain a student over the expanse of your life is useful not just in thinking about language learning and acquisition, but also for your Buddhist practice too. If you decide to take up the language, it may be a long or lifelong journey, but you can still celebrate the small victories along your journey. Your level in the language will depend not on innate skill, but will correlate directly with how much time you decide to spend with it. How well you understand the characters and the grammar will grow as you encounter more sentences and terms in the language. You'll hear many things about current research in language acquisition. You'll find certain places online where the suggestion is that basic fluency in reading a language comes at approximately 100,000 sentences, and that a high level of fluency may happen at around 1 million sentences. While this might sound terrible at first glance, think of how many sentences you read or hear in a day. Think of how many sentences are found in a single book, and how many books do you have on your shelf. Reading and listening are two of the best skills that you can utilize to learn any language. And it just so happens that these are the best skills for maximizing your contact with the sentences of classical Chinese. Even a single word of a single one of these sentences forms a karmic link with that text. In short, just because you don't see immediate or enormous effects from your efforts, or just because you aren't anywhere near hitting 100,000 sentences in literary Chinese, it doesn't mean that you haven't sowed seeds for which you should and can be proud. Read, read, and read some more. Make language learning part of your Buddhism. Tap into the enthusiasm and purpose that your religious sentiment provides you, and form karmic links with these texts, patriarchs and bodhisattvas of the past. If this is not for you, encourage others who might be able to take up this burden. We grow as a Sangha, and you have the capacity to help bring Buddha Dharma to the West directly by learning the language, or indirectly by supporting those who can and will do so. Feel free to make use of some, all, or none of the suggestions, and use this video as a reference when and where it's useful for you. This has been Jikai Dehn of the Enmitsuji Tendai Temple, helping you to become the potent advocate for Dharma that the Buddha calls us to be. Thanks very much.